with it being Easter and having just finished a chapter, not wanting to start in something else with there being a business meeting next week, we're going to be in Matthew 26. So no Samuel tonight. Matthew 26, 26 through 30. And we're going to look a little bit at the Last Supper. We're going to look a little bit at communion and what it is and why we celebrate it, and importantly, why it's actually really critical to understanding the Easter season that we celebrate and how all this connects in. So that's Matthew 26, 26 through 30. Matthew 26, 26 through 30. So one of the things, I guess, about having been here going on 10 and a half years at this point is I assume a lot of you have been here as long as I have, if not longer. So I know there's a small percentage of you that still remembers the skinny kid with the inappropriate t-shirts that showed up in your youth program in the late 90s. But most of you know me as a pastor, and so those are two drastically different people in comparison. And so I forget a lot of you don't always know like my background or my family's background, other than we've kind of always been here in that sense. Because I've been a member here since sometime in 98, so that's also going on 20 years. So I have a confession to make. When I was younger, and none of you can hold this against me because I've been here almost 20 years, I was a Methodist. I know I've got a lot of Reformed Methodists in here with me. Looking at you, Jack. And we saw the light and came to the light side of the force. But kind of growing up, some degree active in the Methodist Church, at least through my elementary years, communion was done differently in the Methodist Church than it was when I first showed up here. When I first showed up here and said we're going to do communion, one, we did it a lot more often than we did the Methodist Church. Two, how many of you remember when we actually had a big loaf of bread that we broke pieces off of? Who remembers that? It's more of you than I thought it was. So back when the church was much smaller, we actually would just get one of those big bakery loaves of bread from like Food Line and pass it around. And then like there was always like one person that tore off this huge hunk of it because they were hungry. That was never me. My sins were many, but still in the Lord's bread was not one of them. Well, what I was used to, and then we get like the little plastic cups that we would all try to see how high we could stack on the back of the pew in like a little tower. This, we were teenagers and that was funny. But in the Methodist Church, we did it completely differently. And so we had a bigger altar, and it was like kind of like a semicircle, and it had these big cushions that you could kneel on. And so you were kind of like dismissed by rows, and you would come down, and you would kneel at the big cushion, and then give you and I'm trying to remember something I did 30 years ago, so I don't know how accurate any of this is. They give me what I remember as being like a tiny little goblet, like a tiny little glass goblet with some grape juice in it. And I would do that part, and I liked grape juice because I was a kid, that was good. And then they would hand me what my dad to this day maintains was a communion wafer. However, the communion wafer looked exactly like the paper bingo chips that we had at school, in my elementary school. So I refused to eat it because I felt the pastor had mistakenly handed me a paper bingo chip. And my parents were very big on me not eating paper. So we'd go down there and we go to the communion, and I'd do the grape juice, and then we get to the communion wafer, and Dad's like, eat it. I'm like, this is a bingo chip. I'm not going to eat it. He's like, eat it. No, it's a bingo chip. I'm not going to eat it. And so we're starting to cause a scene and holding up the rest of the church. Dad just goes, he would have the bread twice, I guess. And so it occurs to me that we take a lot for granted within communion as just a random ritual we do where we have like tiny little crackers and a little thing of grape juice because it has to do with something Jesus did a long time ago. And so what I wanted to do tonight was actually go a little bit more in detail in explaining the Last Supper so we would have a little bit better understanding of what we're going to do on Sunday when we do take the Lord's Supper, and why this is important, and why it was important that Jesus has this last meal before his crucifixion. So that's where we're at in Matthew 26, 26 through 30. Matthew 26, 26 through 30. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to the disciples, and said, "Take, eat, this is my body." Then he took the cup and gave thanks, and gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you, I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So where we're at in the narrative, this is Thursday night. On the last week of Jesus' life, which started with what we celebrated on Sunday. We celebrated Palm Sunday. We celebrated the triumphal entry. Jesus comes in. He comes in as prophesied throughout the Old Testament. And he comes in. What he's doing, he's presenting himself as the Passover lamb, as the sacrifice. And I'm going to get into what all that means a little bit later on. But he comes into town and everyone's celebrating him, and they're laying down the palm branches and they're laying down their coats and they're treating him as this triumphal king. Everybody's really excited. It's interesting how quickly public opinion turned against him in the span of a week, from people cheering him as the Messiah one day, and a week later calling for his blood and literally having him executed, which we will cover more of that during Joint Sunday School. So Jesus has come in, and it's interesting that he has spent a lot of this time making one last impassioned plea to all of Israel, that anyone that listened, to remind them that he was the Messiah, that he was the one sent by God, that he was God incarnate, that he was speaking the truth of God, and all these rituals were empty and had nothing to do with their relationship with God. And so he spent all this time with them, and then he goes, and knowing he's about to be betrayed, goes and celebrates this Passover dinner there with his disciples. So Passover, so the next question is, what is Passover? So I'm going to wager somewhere around the vicinity of about half of you at least have seen the Charlton Heston 10 Commandments movie that they run every year at Easter. If you have not seen it, I have it on DVD. I will let you borrow it. It's fantastic. And so there's this scene in there where God is striking the Egyptians with the 10 plagues. And God is striking them with the plagues because Moses goes up to Pharaoh and says, "God says, let my people go." Pharaoh, who felt he was God on earth, said, "Nope, not going to listen to your God. He can't touch the Egyptian gods." And so each plague subsequently was specifically directed at an Egyptian god. And God worked his way up the tiers. So the last Egyptian god was considered Ra or something to that degree. And he more or less was like the god of life. And so in the last plague, if you remember, was death. Specifically, it was the death of the firstborns across all of the house. And so the only way to avoid this plague was to take the blood of a pure sacrificed lamb and spread it over your doorpost. And then the destroyer would pass over that house. And so every year, as a commemoration and a reminder of their bondage in Egypt and how God freed them, they had this dinner. They had this Passover memorial. And so it was a very intimate meal. It would typically be about 10 to 20 people that celebrated together. It usually wasn't much smaller than that and not much bigger than that. So you just had a lot of immediate family. And everyone's house had it, and everyone stopped everything they were doing to celebrate the Passover. And it was designed as that memorial, an annual reminder of how God protected the Israelites and delivered them from their bondage in Egypt. You can see more of this specifically about Moses and the 10 plagues in Exodus 12, but it was an incredible slaughter of the Egyptians that would have been in the thousands or the tens of thousands. Exodus tells us there was no home where there was not someone dead. But the Lord made these provisions. The Lord spared the Israelites. The angel of death saw the blood of the spotless lamb on the frame of the door, and then he passed over the house. And so one of the things that they did there, God said, all right, you need to be dressed. I know it's nighttime. You need to be dressed because after I do this, Pharaoh's going to let you go. So you need to be ready to go. And so you need to take that lamb that you slaughtered to spread the blood, and you need to eat that lamb, and it needs to be cooked with bitter herbs, and you need to have bread with that meal. Since they didn't have time to wait for the bread to rise, they had unleavened bread, and everything was cooked and eaten that evening as a reminder of what God was about to do. And then every year they had that reminder. Also, during this Passover feast, there would be 4 different cups of wine served and passed around the table, and it was to symbolize God's 4 promises to his people just before deliverance from Egypt. Just a side note, so a lot of you knew I spent about 5 years working for an Israeli company, and I made friends with this one particular Israeli IT guy, and we actually could have a decent conversation about religion, and he was fascinated about the fact that I was a pastor, and liked that he had a, quote, holy man as a friend, and he liked hedging his bets with God. And so we were talking, he goes, the problem with Judaism is everyone goes, well, you got to come here and you got to follow this rule and this rule and this rule. He says, what I try to explain to people is we have 40-some holidays, and they all involve wine. So wine was a really big deal with them, and especially within a lot of their ceremonies. And so that's why you see throughout the Old Testament a lot of these symbolisms and holidays, a lot of it is connected to wine. And so Passover was no different with 4 different cups of wine. One of the things that they were reminded was God's words in Exodus 6. And God spoke to them and said, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God. And so in addition to that, there was a bowl that was passed around, in which they mixed kind of like some oil and some bitter herbs, and they would take pieces of the unleavened bread and dip it into the oil as like a flavoring. And we see that in Matthew 26, where they're passing the bowl around, they're dipping into, they would take their pieces of bread and dip it into that bowl and eat that. And they would eat the bitter herbs, and it would be a reminder of how bitter their bondage was there, and how sweet the wine is in comparison. And so the bitterness was the bondage, and the sweetness was reminding them of God's deliverance. It's interesting when you're reading the Exodus story. It's not long when they're out of Egypt, a couple weeks maybe, where they're going, oh, we had it so good in Egypt. Why are we in this desert? It's hot in this desert. Pharaoh gave us food, and all we had to do was make bricks, and everything was so nice in Egypt. A lot of us forget what God's done for us very quickly. And our theology as Christians isn't, look at all the great deliverance God has given me throughout my life. Comes to, God, what are you going to do for me now? And then we lose our hope, and we lose our focus, and we lose our faith, because we're constantly worried about the next thing. And God has so many different things that he has us do as a memorial for all the things that God has already done for us. And the argument is, if God has redeemed us from our sin, which is something we were completely incapable of doing ourselves, God most certainly can get you through whatever particular earthly, temporary situation or circumstances that we're in right now. And as Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun, and a lot of us are still there right now. Oh God, how are you possibly going to get me out of this? There's no way. This is too strong for you. And the Israelites were no different. And so, in keeping with the Passover, there was a Passover lamb that every family had to have. The lamb had to be slain at twilight, which is right about the setting of the sun. And it translates, that term twilight literally means between the 2 evenings. There's a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus who gives us a lot of our background information, especially about biblical times, and he explains that most likely this slaughter would have happened somewhere between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon in ancient Israel. And after being slaughtered by the priest in the temple, having some of its blood sprinkled there on the altar, the lamb would be taken home by the family that provided it. They would roast it whole, and then they would have it in this Passover meal. They would have their unleavened bread, they would have their bitter herbs, and they would have their wine. Any of the meal that was not finished was to be burned. And so the lesson of the Passover was that deliverance from the judgment of God required the death of an innocent substitute. That was the whole point of the Old Testament sacrificial system, that deliverance was available, but that it comes at a price. And from the perspective of the law, the lamb was pure and spotless, and that was the price that needed to be paid. I always have a lot of people that come to me and say, Pastor, I feel like I'm being called in the ministry, and I go, no, you're not. And they go, I thought you'd be excited for me, and I go, no, I love you too much to be excited for you in this. Everything comes at a price. Everything. And one of the sayings in our house with the kids is, if you want greater privileges, you also have to be able to handle greater responsibilities. And so we don't always understand that doing the right thing for Christ is going to require sacrifice on our part at some part or another. Yet Jesus constantly went out of his way saying, it's going to be hard to follow me. It's going to be hard to follow me. It's going to be hard to follow me. You got to take up your cross and walk with me. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Son of Man is being called the devil. What do you think they're going to call you who follow me? And so this constant warning, but all throughout the Old Testament as well, our sin has consequences. And there is deliverance available, but it always comes at a price. But it wasn't the sacrifice of a spotless lamb that was going to ultimately satisfy God's wrath. My old roommate had the best analogy for this. And he's saying, so the way I look at it, the Old Testament with the constantly sacrificing the lambs, it'd be like if I spilled some milk in the kitchen and then I covered it up with newspaper. It covers up the mess temporarily, but it's not going to get the job done permanently. And so all these sacrifices basically could not make a permanent removal for the sin in our lives. What they did was to point ahead to God's ultimate provision, and that he was going to provide the true Passover lamb in the sacrifice of his son. So on the same day Jesus came into town for the triumphal entry was the same day most of the families were arriving to present their own personal Passover lambs. So when he shows up, he was the only one that understood he's presenting himself as the Passover lamb. And the moment he dies on the cross is the exact same moment the priests were busy at the temple slaughtering all of the Passover lambs right there in between 3 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. See, we're told that the law was only a shadow of the good things to come and not the form of the things, because it was never by the same sacrifices which were offered yearly could make any of us perfect. Otherwise, if they could, one sacrifice would have been sufficient and no longer would have been needed. But those sacrifices were a reminder of sins year by year. As we're told in Hebrews 10, it was impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So more than 1,500 years, give or take, after Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, Jesus prepares to celebrate what is truly the final Passover with his disciples, and what becomes what we now refer to as the Lord's Supper. In Luke 22, Jesus says, I earnestly desire to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. He understood of the importance of this because it was a very pivotal moment in his history. He still had a whole lot to teach his disciples before he would get handed over to the Sanhedrin. And a lot of that actually came after the fact, after his resurrection. What we see in the Last Supper is a prime example of God's sovereignty. Christ and his disciples were celebrating the Passover one night before the rest of Jerusalem was. If you're a good Israelite in the Old Testament, Passover was celebrated on Friday night, but they're celebrating it on Thursday night. And the reason of that is the Galilean Jews observed Passover on Thursday night because they marked their day from sunrise to sunrise, while the rest of the country marked their day from sunset to sunset. So when you're reading the account of the crucifixion, they come to break Jesus' legs, and because they didn't want him hanging up there for Passover, but he's already had the Passover supper. And so some of you thought, I've never caught that before. Well, there you go. So it's important to recognize that, one, this was a legit Passover celebration, but it specifically was a Galilean Passover celebration because of the way this one unique area of Jerusalem tracked time. And so it allowed Jesus to both celebrate the Passover in fulfillment of the law and also be the Passover at the same time. And as he sat there in that upper room with his disciples, he knew what was going to happen, and he's preparing himself and his closest friends for the moment he was about to be handed over for the execution. And over the span of Israel's history, who knows how many millions of Passover lambs were slaughtered for the sins of all the different families that had been through generations, each of them foreshadowing the sacrifice that Jesus was about to make to free God's people from the bondage of their sins. And all of this had been building and building and building for thousands of years. And here it is. The final, true, perfect, spotless lamb has arrived. And exactly as at that hour of slaughter, Jesus would die, and there was this big, thick veil in the temple that separated the holiest of holies from the rest of the temple. And only the high priest had access to the holiest of holies. And to be in the holiest of holies was considered to be in the presence of God. As Jesus was being sacrificed, there was an earthquake, and this giant curtain that separated that off, ripped completely, and ripped from top to bottom, signifying, one, that God was available to everyone, and two, that the system of sacrifice was soon going to come to an end. There hasn't been a true, proper Passover sacrifice since 70 AD. And that was when Titus and the Roman army came, literally burned Jerusalem to the ground, pried the temple apart, brick by brick, exactly as Jesus said was going to happen just days before he was crucified. Christ ended the Passover, and with the end of the Passover, he instituted a new memorial to himself. No longer are we to look back to a lamb and to Egypt as the ultimate symbol of God's redeeming love. But now we look at the cross and the Lamb of God and how the sacrificial shedding of his blood bought the salvation that we also freely have access to and we also enjoy. In this one meal, Jesus puts a cap on the old and brings about the new. And so there's a couple of symbolisms that he brings in, and he talks about breaking the unleavened bread. And this was a normal part of the traditional Passover ceremony, but Jesus gives it new meaning. And he says here in Matthew, he says, "Take, eat, this is my body." Some of the other gospels says, "Take, eat, this is my body, which is broken for you." And when he did that, he literally took the bread and snapped it in half. And that unleavened bread symbolized a detachment, not only from the old life in Egypt, but as we take it, it symbolizes our detachment from our old lives, from the people we were before Christ and the people we are now. And as a side note, if that's not a different person, it's time to check your heart. It's time to have a really serious, important one-on-one conversation with the Lord. And so by his authority, Jesus transforms that symbolism. And so the bread now for us represents Jesus' body, sacrifice for the salvation of all men. Jesus says in Luke 22, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." So each time we take communion, we're to be reminded of that sacrifice that Jesus made for us, that we could never make on our own. And then as he's passing the cups, the disciples drank of the cup, and Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant," or of the new covenant, distinguishing this from all the other covenants throughout the Bible. God makes lots of covenants. He makes lots of covenants in the Old Testament. And you might not realize that's what they're called. But we see a covenant with Noah. Noah steps off the boat. What does Noah see when he steps off the boat? A rainbow. The rainbow was God's covenant with Noah, that he's not going to flood the earth again because of wickedness. Later on in Genesis, we see God establishing a covenant with Abraham that involved a land and descendants and blessing. And we see animals being sacrificed for that covenant. So you have this thing called the Abrahamic covenant that gave them the land that we now call Israel. And then after Moses is out of Egypt, he goes to Mount Sinai. And there God gives him the 10 Commandments. And he says, follow these words of mine and you shall be blessed. And that becomes something that we refer to as the Mosaic covenant. And basically that's the Old Testament. The Mosaic covenant is the law. But when Jesus stands up, he brings reconciliation for everyone. And the price was always blood. There was never a scenario where God removed sin from the world that was not going to require the death of his son. There was never a scenario that existed like that, regardless of what anyone may teach you. When we look in Revelation, we see them giving praise and honor and glory to the Lamb. They say, the Lamb who was slain before the very foundations of the earth. That means before Genesis 1:1, this was the plan. God knew what was going to happen, and he knew how he was going to resolve it. This has been the plan the whole time. This isn't God scrambling to take care of something because he forgot something at the last minute. This has always been the plan. And so, Jesus did not simply have to die, but he specifically had to shed his own blood. Because we see in Exodus and Hebrews and 1 Peter and Leviticus, both Old and New Testament, that again, without blood, there is no remission of sins. And so Jesus dies there from his wounds and from bleeding. Ultimately, his death on the cross is he drowned. And you're like, how did he drown? He wasn't in any water. From all the different internal wounds, it got to the point where he could no longer breathe as his lungs filled up. And then we see that when they pierced him in the side with the spear, and they said like water and blood poured out. And so as he was dead, there was just through the whole crucifixion process. And if you ever saw Passion of the Christ, you saw this. There was just tremendous amounts of blood. I remember when we were first seeing that movie at Palace Point, and then we had like another screening of it somewhere else, and someone goes, "That was really brutal." And I'm like, yes, it was. I imagine it actually was far worse in real life. Because there's an aspect of us watching that, understanding that's a movie, and that's like, Hollywood special effects. But the reality is the Roman crucifixion process was created to do a couple of things. One, it was to push a body to the absolute maximum amount of physical pain it could endure before it gave out. Secondly, it was a lot of psychological warfare involved in that as well. Not only were you breaking this person physically, you were breaking this person mentally as well, with all the different beatings and floggings and trials and carrying heavy pieces of wood. But everyone else watching is going, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be that person. And so this was a really brutal, bloody endeavor for that part. And so we see a lot of that blood that we have in the Passover lambs, most certainly being poured out by Jesus there on the cross. And so one of the other things that people try to get into is, was like Jesus' blood magical? Well, yes and no, not really in like the sense that we think of it. But it is his blood that saves, and the shedding of his blood was what was required. And that atoning death of his holy, righteous life is the only thing that could possibly satisfy God's wrath for us unregenerate people. So that blood atonement is for the sins of all who place their trust in the Lord Jesus Christ. And so I've gotten a really good question that I get every so often, and it's and David's talked about this some, is, are we going to meet like Ruth and Boaz and Adam and Eve and stuff and people in heaven? And I don't have time to get into like the very lengthy seminary answer, but the short version is yes. And you go, well, how did people in the Old Testament get saved if Jesus hasn't died yet? Well, they got saved the same way we do. by looking at the cross. Now here in the New Testament, we look back at the cross to Jesus. Well, in the Old Testament, they were looking forward to the cross and the Messiah that was to come. And you have to keep in mind that all our prophecies about who Jesus is and was and would live and what he would do all came from the Old Testament. God's faithful people were always constantly looking for the Messiah, for the redemption of mankind. And we see that all the way back in Genesis chapter 3 with Adam and Eve. We see as Eve gave birth to more and more sons, you see her rejoicing, hoping that one of these might be this long-awaited Messiah that's going to make an end to sin. And so I think we forget at Easter what all Jesus actually did for us. Which is sad because it's the one thing we're supposed to remember. We're supposed to remember it in all the services leading up to it. And we're supposed to remember it every time we take the Lord's Supper. And we're most certainly supposed to remember it while we're in the Easter service. Well, what happens really easy is we fall into routine and we fall into ritual and we fall into, well, I'm going to go here at the same time at the same place and sit in this seat and do this same thing, and it's Easter, and yay, and we move on. But for those of us who belong to Jesus, this event in the upper room, the Lord's Supper, leading all the way through his death and his burial and his resurrection, and the hope that soon he will return to us in glory. This is what we celebrate at Easter. And what it really boils down to is we celebrate the fact that God had a plan. And more importantly, he decided to include us in it. I know who my planners are and aren't here within the congregation. And I dare say how many of us factor in future plans about tonight or tomorrow, the next week, or 5 years from now. How many of us factor God into our plans, right? On a consistent daily basis, especially if it's more than, well, if God wills, I'll do this and this, right? And one of the most ridiculous questions I always felt when I was having to do interviews within the IT world is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I'm like, I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow, much less what's going to be 5 years from now. The one thing I do see about 5 years from now is it's probably going to be absolutely nothing that I imagine it being like, because there's the things I would like to happen in 5 years, and there's the things that are going to happen in 5 years. And they're two distinctly different things. But what matters is am I walking with the Lord? Am I serving my Lord? Am I serving my family? Am I serving my church? That's the three things I hope I'm doing 5 years from now. And beyond that, I will leave the details up to God. But this Easter, I want you to take a fresh look at the Lord's Supper, a fresh look at the resurrection, and rejoice in the fact that God not only had a plan, he specifically had a plan that included each and every one of us. Brother David Hess, will you close us in a word of prayer?
Lord, we just thank you so much for tonight's message and just an opportunity to pause and reflect on just what it means that you demonstrated your love so much for us that while we were still sinners, you died for us. It was that bloodshed on the cross that allows you to look down upon us and see your Son, Jesus Christ, to see us as sinless before you. Lord, I pray that we would be a church who disciplines ourselves for the purpose of godliness, that we look more like Jesus Christ today than we did yesterday, more today than we do tomorrow, Lord. Father God, I just pray that you would continue to keep us focused on what it means to love you and to obey your commandments. And as we move into this weekend and pause to reflect on Easter and the sacrifice that was made on the cross, may we humble ourselves before you, force us through the power of the Holy Spirit to decrease and for you to increase in our lives. We pray all this in your name. Amen.
Amen. Love you guys. Hope to see you Saturday and Sunday.